and with whom I've been working, Denise, I guess you could say several years maybe. And so you are author of The Myth of Capitalism, Monopolies and the Death of Competition, a great book, and currently a resident senior fellow at the Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment, where you have written, I guess you could call it a white paper on antitrust and sustainability, a landscape analysis. And we've done a podcast together on antitrust from a multi-level perspective. So it's great to be interacting with someone like you, and then to add to that with your seminar. So let's take it away. Thank you, Denise.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much, David, for having me, and for all of you for joining. Yeah, I'm really excited to be in conversation with you all, and particularly with David, because as you'll see as we get into the presentation, these questions about competition and collaboration are quite profound. And as you know, some of the international regulatory agencies are really wrestling with how to understand these issues, I thought, well, these are really multi-level selection questions. You know, how do you figure out where the boundaries are, when you should encourage competition, when you should encourage collaboration, and what are how do we think about which groups should do that? So that's what we're going to get into today. And just a little bit more on my background. I've spent the last kind of 5 or 6 years researching and working at policy on market concentration issues. So thinking about how power manifests in economic systems, and really the only legal regime that we have to deal with that is competition policy and antitrust. So that's why I found myself continuing to work on this, even though my interests are quite wide. And you know, this is why I pursue people like David, so that I can keep learning about other industries and sort of other fields. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get started. I think the format is that I will present maybe try to keep it to sort of 40 minutes, 45 minutes or something, and then we'll go into Q&A, if that works for everyone else.
Yep, that's just fine.
Okay, great. So everyone can see the slides okay?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, awesome. All right, competition or collaboration for a sustainable economy. I want to start with 2 quotes. So the first is from Rachel Carson. We stand now where 2 roads diverge, but unlike the roads in Robert Frost's familiar poem, they are not equally fair. The road we have long been traveling is deceptively easy, a smooth superhighway on which we progress with great speed, but at its end lies disaster. The other fork of the road, the one less traveled by, offers our only chance to reach a destination that assures the preservation of the earth. The second quote is from the former US Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, who was speaking about antitrust. And he says, antitrust laws in general, and the Sherman Act in particular, are the Magna Carta of free enterprise. They are as important to the preservation of economic freedom and our free enterprise system as the Bill of Rights is to the protection of our fundamental personal freedoms. And the freedom guaranteed each and every business, no matter how small, is the freedom to compete, to assert with vigor, imagination, devotion, and ingenuity, whatever economic muscle it can muster. So this presentation, as David mentioned, is going to really focus on this report that I just recently co-authored with 2 colleagues, Cynthia Hannawalt and Lisa Sachs, at 2 centers that are at the Columbia Law School and Columbia Earth Center. Columbia Earth School, and it looks at this intersection between antitrust law and sustainability. And when we think about antitrust law, I mean, it used to be, you know, if you mentioned antitrust at parties, you'd sort of be relegated to the corner. No one wanted to talk to you because it wasn't that interesting. And it was a relatively sort of dormant body of law for about 40 years, where, especially in the US, the agencies were not that aggressive in their enforcement strategies. But, you know, it's really come to the fore with the advent of big tech and a whole host of other issues. It's kind of gained a resurgence. There's a big popular movement. There's an anti-monopoly movement. Biden appointed 2 enforcers as the head of the FTC and the DOJ, who are quite aggressive in their enforcement stance. And And so it's kind of become, and I'll get into this a little bit later, but it's really come to the fore again. And antitrust law is kind of a subset of a broader set of policies called competition policy, which looks at market structure and looks at competitive dynamics within industries. And it's a really interesting body of work because it really intersects every other legal regime in some way. It looks at consumer protection, it intersects with labor law, increasingly with environmental law and other areas. It deals with industrial policy, it deals with geopolitical implications. So, I've tried in a way to move away from antitrust, but it's just too interesting. So I haven't quite been able to escape it. And most jurisdictions around the world now have competition policy laws, and many of them will follow the US or the European regime in different ways. So I can get more into that as well. Now, when we think about sustainability, that word as well is incredibly broad. Here I have Kate Raworth's Donut Economics schema, where she says a safe and just space for humanity is operating within this donut of not surpassing ecological ceilings and not undershooting social foundations. And so when you look at these things like ocean acidification, climate change, air pollution, biodiversity loss, and then you look at the social factors like access to health, food, water, energy, housing, social equity, when you think about sustainability in its broadest terms, it really deals with sort of every potential market, every sector of the economy. And so when you think about the ways in which competition policy intersects with sustainability, it's really incredibly, incredibly broad. So the reason why all of this has started to gain sort of political traction is because there's a narrative that antitrust is getting in the way of needed sustainability collaboration, particularly for private actors. So companies, antitrust is about fostering competition in theory, and companies increasingly are facing pressure from their shareholders or from consumers to collaborate on sustainability related projects. Maybe they want to figure out how to eradicate slavery in their supply chain. Maybe they are being, there's increasing regulatory pressure to disclose their scope 3 emissions and things that are, difficult to calculate, and they're very industry specific. Should they be able to get together with their competitors and work on these types of issues together? As I said, there's sort of these different growing movements. There's kind of sustainable finance, reimagining capitalism, responsible corporate governance, and stakeholder capitalism, and all of these things. But then you have an uneven regulatory response. So the SEC is, eventually going to ask companies to disclose on their climate risk. In Europe, they just, I think, solidified today or this week the new updated rules for climate risk disclosures. But, there's uneven sort of jurisdictional approaches to how companies should be incorporating these types of considerations into their disclosures, but also into their strategy. And there's also, so at the same time that you have this sort of growing responsible business movement and stakeholder capitalism, there's also this growing antitrust and anti-monopoly framework, and the two don't tend to interact very much until recently. And in some cases, they have sort of competing theories of change, because corporate governance and stakeholder capitalism focuses on what happens within the corporation, while antitrust focuses on what happens in markets and in economies and how firms interact together. And those terrains overlap, but again, they might have differing theories of change. So I think I will just say that what really has catalyzed this in the US is that there are a number of financial institution coalitions that started joining net zero alliances. And they started making commitments to essentially to move away from oil and gas and fossil fuels and stop financing new coal or new fossil fuel projects. And there was inevitable pushback, of course, and it mostly came from the fossil fuel lobby. And they said, hang on a second, you're getting together as an industry, you are committing to these targets. And actually, that sounds a lot like an antitrust violation. It sounds like collusion to me. It sounds like a climate cartel or an ESG cartel. And you can see here that C. Boyd and Gray wrote a big Wall Street Journal article back in 2020 saying that, this was that the financial industry was starving the energy sector of capital, and that wasn't, fair, free market competition. It was actually collusion, subsidizing, new industries, new renewable industries and things like that. And then Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton also wrote to BlackRock in 2020 saying that their involvement in Climate Action 100 Plus, which is a consortium of a number of different financial institutions, was akin to anti-drilling coercion, which threatened national security, hurts Americans struggling to buy gas, and appears to violate antitrust laws, and that this was going to invite billions of dollars in antitrust liability. So this narrative started to solidify that these types of climate collaborations were an antitrust violation. And then all of a sudden, everyone sort of woke up and said, well, what in the world is antitrust law? And should we, is this true? Are we actually violating antitrust? So I mentioned, Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero is has been the biggest target of this. It was started by Mark Carney a few years ago. It has 7 different sub-alliances. So they've broken the financial ecosystem into different sectors. There's one for asset managers, and that includes big asset managers, index providers like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. Then there's a Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, which tends to be things like pension funds and sovereign wealth funds that actually hire asset managers. Then there's a banking alliance, there's a financial service providers alliance, there's an insurers alliance, and so forth. And they've been quite successful at getting signatories, and you can see some of the assets that they have represented within these groups, 70 trillion in the banking alliance and so forth. So once this narrative started to percolate, and it's been very coordinated. So, the state attorneys general at the state level started accusing firms of violating antitrust, and they started sending subpoena letters and civil investigative demands. The House GOP also started sending letters and saying, give us all this information about your ESG or your climate related collaborations. So once these threats sort of solidified, the GFANZ decided to drop the language that it had required its members to agree to, which was that they were going to agree to phase out the development or financing and facilitation of new fossil fuels, including coal. So that was the real key language, because the argument was this is akin to an antitrust boycott. You can't get everyone together in a room, a bunch of competitors, and agree to boycott an industry. Now, whether or not this actually is an antitrust violation is difficult to assess, because one, there's no case precedent for a group of financiers getting together and agreeing to not finance a particular sector. And they don't compete with the entities that they finance. So it's not a traditional boycott where typically you would have a couple of companies in the same industry, maybe collectively agreeing that they're going to bar a new entrant or do something anti-competitive to another company that's that's a competitor. So this is something altogether new. So that's, so this question of whether these agreements actually do violate antitrust law is kind of difficult to answer. Although I don't think that it does. And, I'm happy to go into more detail, but the reality is that a case like this would be very, very difficult to bring if you are the plaintiff bringing the case. I think it would be very, very hard to build the legal argument that this indeed violates antitrust. But the other reason why this is difficult is because in the US, we have a federated system of enforcement of antitrust. So you have not only the 2 federal agencies, the Federal Trade Commission and the DOJ, but you also have every state at the state attorneys general level can co-enforce the federal laws. And in some cases, the states also have their own unique antitrust laws that they can also enforce. And so this really has primarily happened at the state level, which makes it difficult, because even if the federal agencies might be, they haven't signaled that they're supportive to these types of collaborations, but even if they were, that doesn't preclude the states or even private actors from bringing antitrust cases against these types of collaborations. So when we think about all this, it really begs the question, like, again, what type of collaboration do we want to encourage through the regulatory environment and through the law? And I was in Japan 2 weeks ago presenting on this very topic at UNPRI, Principles for Responsible Investment, which is one of the biggest groups that kind of responsible investment groups globally. And these two headlines happened that very week in Japan, which I thought were a perfect illustration of this. So one is 20 companies are cooperating on a project to reuse EV batteries. So companies getting together within the same industry, the auto manufacturers and others, to figure out how they could better do a sort of circular economy project where they were going to reuse certain material inputs to better extend and prolong the life of EV batteries. The second was that Japan's antitrust body called the Fair Trading Commission found that a bunch of insurers had gotten together and fixed prices for 100 of their clients, and that they had obviously raised prices over and above what they would have done if they had been competing properly. So the problem when we say that collaboration is good is that it's not always good, right? And antitrust law exists to help us answer these fundamental questions. What does pro-social collaboration look like? There's anti-social forms of collaboration like cartels and collusion that we want to avoid. How do we protect the public from anti-social forms of collaboration? How do we define and measure the pro-social benefits and anti-social harms? And ultimately, which economic actors should have collaboration rights? The majority of this conversation so far has focused on the coordination rights of private firms. But actually, there's a phenomenal academic named Professor Sanjukta Pal, who's an antitrust expert and labor expert. And she says, actually, the central function of antitrust law is to allocate economic coordination rights. And the questions that we should be asking are, who should be allowed to coordinate to shape market dynamics, under what terms, and in whose benefit? So you have shareholders and shareholder coalitions saying they're using something called the universal ownership theory, where they say, listen, we own so many stocks and so many assets that are across the globe, they're in every sector. And so we universally own a little piece of the market, of the entire market, and therefore we can't diversify away our climate risk. We can't diversify away these systemic risks like deforestation and inequality and all these other things. And so actually we're incentivized now to try to internalize these previously held externalities. And so antitrust should give us special accommodation to collaborate so that we can influence the companies that we're invested in to better sustainability outcomes. So that's called the universal ownership theory. It's contested. There's a lot of academic literature and debate on either side as to whether truly shareholders' interests are aligned with the public. But that's one argument. Then we have companies in the same industry saying that they need special accommodation through their industry associations or through their collaborations to work on sustainability. Also, what about workers? So there's been times in the past where antitrust law has been used to go after unions and say that that's an illegal form of coordination. And currently in the US, independent workers, gig workers, contract workers, they don't have antitrust exemption to be able to coordinate and assert their collective bargaining rights. What about small and medium-sized businesses who are up against Amazon? Should they have special accommodation to coordinate? And then interestingly, regulators. So increasingly, the antitrust agencies are starting to collaborate, internationally and even on really challenging merger cases, right? Because if Google wants to buy some company, it's a multinational company, it operates all over the world, and it might get challenged in multiple jurisdictions. So regulators are starting to share information and collaborate more on bringing these types of complex cases. But that's received pushback from groups like the US Chamber of Commerce, who say that they shouldn't be, that this is somehow like an illegal form of coordination. So it really just demonstrates that these are really profound questions about who we want to collaborate to shape markets and what outcomes we think that will generate. I like this Jane Jacobs quote from The Nature of Economies that says, an economy consists of interdependent relationships competing and yet also knitting together co-developments. And she emphasizes in this book that it's not just about competition. The second evolutionary thrust, if you will, is habitat maintenance. And so there's elements of both competition and collaboration that need to be present in order for sustainable systems to exist. And so, when we think about this question of how antitrust law or competition policy can support sustainability, there's kind of, these four main considerations. One is areas in which competition might actually drive more innovation in sustainability. So if firms are competing, they might have more incentive to invest in R&D. They might, they can't rest on their laurels. They need to actually invest in green innovation and bring products to market faster and things like that. And those are the benefits of competition. There might be areas in which collaboration might drive more ambition in sustainability through these sort of coordinated industry groups. There's market power concerns, so areas in which competitor collaborations or mergers and acquisitions result in concentrations of economic power or anti-competitive behavior that will negatively impact sustainability goals. When you think about the predominant firms who are responsible for most of the emissions, I mean, you can list them on two hands, right? There's a very, very small set of really, really large companies who are the biggest offenders in terms of, pollution or emissions. And so market concentration itself in some ways has already had negative impacts on sustainability. And then areas in which consumer preferences for sustainability, also have an impact on what's called the consumer welfare analysis standard, which I'll just briefly get into here. But, when the anti-monopoly laws were created in the US in particular in the late 1800s, they were a response to concentrated markets, to the trusts, right? So the concentrated railroads and coal and steel and everything else, the Rockefellers, the robber barons of the time. That's why it's called antitrust, because it was about trust busting, breaking up the trusts. And over time, that kind of original basis for focusing on concentrations of private power, which they felt undermined democracy, undermined, the political health, the healthiness of the political system. Those kind of concerns started to ebb away, and there was a very concerted effort on the part of particular conservative judges and scholars to kind of move that aside as a consideration and say, actually, the only thing that antitrust law should think about is the effect on the consumer, and that lowering prices or creating efficiencies for consumers is the fundamental goal of competition policy. So they kind of left these market power questions aside. And what's happened under the Biden administration is that the new enforcers are really trying to reassert this sort of anti-monopoly origins of antitrust and say, of course we care what happens to consumers, and of course we want low prices, but we're not just consumers, we're workers, we're citizens. And as an example with big tech, many of the biggest technology firms like Alphabet and Meta, Apple, were allowed to acquire literally hundreds and hundreds of companies and competitors over a period of about a decade. And none of those mergers were challenged by the antitrust agencies because they were offering free products for the most part, right? And so they're keeping prices low for consumers, and all these other externalities around, privacy or the undermining of democracy, or any of these things were sort of considered market externalities that antitrust law didn't consider. So that's changing. So as I said, we had Lena Khan, Jonathan Cantor, also Tim Wu, who's also at Columbia, came to the White House under Biden, and he initiated this whole of government approach, getting the agencies to think about antitrust across a number of different sectors. There was an executive order on competition that Biden initiated in 2021 that tasked all the agencies, the Health Agency, Department of Defense, Department of Agriculture, and so forth, to have them think about the ways in which concentrated markets are undermining, farmer welfare or undermining national security and these sorts of things. And it instituted a bunch of different initiatives that each agency had to take to respond. So again, just that there's now what used to be a kind of mostly solidified area of law has really blown open in the last sort of decade. And there's all these reconsiderations happening about how we should reconstitute this body of law and policy to meet 21st century market realities. And sustainability is one of those things, but other things like digital markets, new digital gatekeepers, AI, data, privacy concerns, market concentration, the rise of private equity firms and the role that they're playing in the economy, which has really impacted consolidation, financial complexity and the financialization of firms, global economies of scale and scope, and when natural monopolies are okay, or when they're when they're perhaps not, geopolitical conflict and trade wars, industrial policy, and so forth. So all of these new considerations are really causing a pretty big rethink in this area. When you ask these questions, ideologies really diverge. So what is actually competition policy for? What are the boundaries of it? The normative questions. Then if we agree on those, which we don't, what are the methods of achieving those goals? And then how do we technically implement them? So what's interesting is that, the EU and the UK have recently taken the competition agencies have been very vocal about the fact that they want to support sustainability and they don't want competition policy to get in the way. So they've been really focused on sort of their, different methods and technical implementation of how they would do this. Whereas the US is in a way, so that the narrative is that the EU and the UK are much further ahead than the US on this. And in some ways they definitely are. On the other hand, the US is having really deep debates about the goals of antitrust law, and they are really engaging with these normative questions, both in the academic community, but also in the practitioner community. And so in a way, you could say that they're asking more profound questions, and therefore, maybe they're a little bit ahead in some ways. So you can see here that these are some of the goals that people argue, is competition policy just for competition, protecting the competitive process? Is it for consumer welfare? Is it for the dispersion of market power? Is it about fairness? Is it about all these other goals like the preservation of democracy, protecting small businesses? Is it about ensuring that workers don't have to deal with monopsony issues where there's just one or a few buyers of their labor, and then that market power pushes down their wages and so forth? So, as I said, there's a divergence between how the US and Europe is handling this. And as I referenced earlier, with the kind of Republican backlash to anything ESG or sustainability related, it makes it very difficult for the agencies to engage on this question because they have these sort of targets on their back. And there's a very active campaign as well there's a major sort of deregulatory agenda happening where there are court cases before the Supreme Court arguing that some of the regulatory agencies have gone beyond their constitutional authority, and they've gone beyond what is deemed that Congress has allowed, and therefore that they don't have the ability to issue rulemakings and things like that. And so one of the things that the Federal Trade Commission did earlier this year is they proposed a rule for the entire US economy that they were going to ban non-compete agreements, which is, workers sign these sometimes when they get hired by a firm, and then they can't go work for a competitive firm for a certain period of time after they leave that firm. Well, that makes sense for really, workers who have access to trade secrets, or a lot of knowledge workers or something. But these had proliferated to such a degree that janitors were forced to sign them, and fast food workers were forced to sign them, and hairdressers and everything else, right? Which is crazy. And so the FTC said, you know what, we think that this is it's a way to limit worker mobility, which means that they can't go elsewhere and bargain for higher wages. And so it actually drives wages down by about $300 billion a year was their calculation. So this is just one example of a rule that they've proposed that has received a lot of pushback, and that now through something called the major questions doctrine, it might be deemed unconstitutional. So it's a way to take away the power of the agencies to actually enforce the law in different ways or propose different rulemakings. Let's see here. Okay, just a few more slides. We're almost there. So the other thing to remember is that competitor collaborations and these sort of questions about firms working together on sustainability are really one more narrow aspect of the agency remits overall. So generally they deal with mergers and acquisitions, consumer protection issues, where they look at, product safety and false marketing claims, including greenwashing. They police unfair or fraudulent business activities under consumer protection. And then anti-competitive behavior, both coordinated or group anti-competitive behavior, which is what I've highlighted here. So they worry about things like cartels, group boycotts, refusals to deal, price fixing, market allocation, and bid rigging. And then they also deal with anti-competitive single firm conduct like monopolization or firms using unfair methods of competing, like doing exclusive dealing and stuff like that. So they have a whole range of activities that they are responsible for enforcing against. And I say this to say that increasingly to incorporate sustainability considerations, it doesn't just have to fall to private companies saying that they want to solve all the world's problems. There are other ways in which the agencies can consider incorporating sustainability considerations into their enforcement agenda. So I guess one example is with mergers and acquisitions. So I'm sure everyone's aware that Exxon has recently announced that it wants to acquire Pioneer in the Permian Basin and kind of double down on its oil and gas production. I don't know if people followed this, but a year or two ago, there was a big push by progressives who using something called engine number one, which managed to actually upset a couple of board seats and get essentially some environmentalists onto the board of ExxonMobil. And everyone was very excited about this because they thought that this was going to fundamentally change Exxon and that all of a sudden, you'd be able to inculcate these kind of environmental concerns into the biggest oil company in the US. And what we, have recently learned through this acquisition is maybe that theory of change wasn't so successful, that actually, they're now, again, they're doubling down on this acquisition. They're acquiring, it's a oil and gas producer. And interestingly, I listened to Darren Woods say that this was going to advance their net zero targets because they were going to be able to help Pioneer, the company they're acquiring, reduce its net zero goal from 2050 to 2035. So they were going to move up the timeline through, all the advancements that Exxon has, and that this was a commitment to their low carbon business, which is natural gas. And so they're sort of arguing that this is, in a way, this is an environmentally positive move. Now, who has to approve that merger? The FTC. So there are many ways in which these kind of intersections are starting to become more and more unignorable. Now, it's not just about financial institution collaborations. So there are many other ways that companies collaborate. And one of them, as an example, is should fashion houses, which one of the fundamental tensions here is that antitrust typically has encouraged maximizing output, right? And so if you get a bunch of fashion houses together, they all argue that there's a first mover disadvantage if they stop producing so much crap that ultimately ends up in the landfill. And if one company says, okay, we're going to scale back, we're not going to produce so much fast fashion and everything else, that their competitors are just going to do it. So they can't do it alone. They need to get together as an industry, and they need to essentially agree to restrict output. And probably the way that they're going to do that is also by increasing prices, because they're going to pay more theoretically, if they improve their production processes, don't use so much fossil fuel, products in their shirts or whatever, that's going to cost more. And so essentially they want to come together, reduce output, and raise prices, which is a classic antitrust violation. So it's raising some really interesting questions for antitrust. is antitrust law focus on output maximization and price reduction fundamentally in tension with some of our sustainability goals? And, should we be okay with coordinated price rises by the industry, in some cases, if they want to pay more, they want to do greener steel, they want to do something that's fundamentally going to cost more. Are we okay with them passing on those costs to consumers by way of higher prices? Or is this potentially companies seeking too much leniency from the law so that they can do just a tiny bit of sustainability and a big amount of price rising, right? So those are the big questions. And actually there was a case in which a chicken poultry producer said, you know what, we really care about chicken welfare because we know that we've treated chickens really poorly, and they can't walk around in their cages and they're just stuck in there. And so we're going to expand their cages and we're going to give them a little bit more room to walk around. And this was in the Netherlands. And actually the Dutch agency said, you know what, we like that, of course we all agree we'd like the chickens to have a better life, but actually this smells a little fishy to us, and it smells like an output restriction and that you just want to charge more for poultry. And so they didn't allow them to do that. And what ultimately happened was that through the process of that, there was an industry sort of collective agreement that ended up being more ambitious than what the company had originally said. And so ultimately the chicken output or the chicken welfare was much better than what the individual company had proposed. And it was kind of seen as like, this is a way in which these kind of sustainability goals might be used, in ways which, again, like get you just a little bit of sustainability, but ultimately benefit the company a lot more. And so these are really challenging, questions for regulators to try to figure out. So just really quickly, other forms of collaborations include things like group purchasing agreements, joint R&D, joint ventures, information sharing, production agreements, technical development, and then of course standard setting or industry associations, mandatory agreements, things like that. So these are the things that the agencies have released, the UK and the EU have, and Japan and others have created updated guidelines which explicitly say these are the types of collaborations that you can engage with which do not breach the law. These are the type of ones that you might be a little bit careful about, and then these are the type of things that really are not okay. And it's a short list. It's like, price fix, don't get together and price fix, don't get together and fix markets and divide them amongst you as competitors, and don't share competitively sensitive information that you don't need to. So yeah, I think I will say that even though these are challenging questions, regulators have wrestled with these for a long time. And like I mentioned in the past, they've typically said in the past that maximizing efficiency was the goal of these types of things. And so there, in many of the laws or guidelines, there are efficiencies exemptions. So it's if a firm can say, oh, we're going to create all these efficiencies and we're going to pass them on to the consumer by way of lower prices, sometimes they would allow anti-competitive behavior, or they would allow a merger to go through. Now, most of the literature said, especially in mergers, after those mergers, did prices actually fall? Well, the answer is in 95% of cases, if companies merged and then there were 6 or fewer competitors left in the industry, prices actually rose following the merger because now they have more market power, so they can use it to raise prices on consumers. But the point is that, the weighing of these benefits and harms is not new to competition policy, but perhaps these new sustainability gains are kind of the new efficiency gains that companies are proposing as deserving of like new safe harbors or exemptions. So while I'm in favor of companies playing a critical role in helping us transition to a more sustainable economy across many areas, I also think the regulators need to be really careful about how they write the guidelines and think about the complexity here. The Australians actually amended their anti-cartel law in 2020, and they said that as long as companies are collaborating for some climate neutral or eco-sustainable purpose, that they won't come after them as a cartel, which is the most permissive of any regulatory regime so far. It's the only one that's actually updated the legislation. And as I mentioned, many other agencies have issued updated guidance. In the US, nothing's happening. The US, well, I'm working on it, obviously, but the agencies have not issued any guidance themselves. The only thing that they've said is if companies are getting together for some sort of ESG purpose, it still doesn't, it's not a shield for enforcement. A good purpose doesn't preclude them coming after you if you're still acting anti-competitively, essentially. So the key takeaways here that there are these sort of acute financial institution problems around the climate agreements and the net zero agreements. Even though the Republicans have made a lot of noise and asked for all these investigative demands, they actually haven't brought an antitrust legal case yet, and we don't know if they will and how they would frame it, but it still kind of caused a big chilling effect on the industry. The collaboration questions, go far beyond that for regulators. And then again, this is challenging in the US in particular, just because of the complexity of the regulatory environment where you have the feds and the states co-enforcing. And then you also have many other federal agencies that have antitrust authority, like the Department of Transport can block mergers. So it's a really wide sort of patchwork of where antitrust authority falls in the US, and that makes it more complex. So my final kind of key takeaway is just that incentivizing private actors to align their practices with sustainability and climate goals, I think, is going to require policies and regulations throughout the economy. Certainly voluntary initiatives can be useful, but I think the stronger way to deal with it is through a comprehensive regulatory regime, which will incentivize private actors to align, and that competition policy and its enforcement agencies are one component of that broad policy framework, but they're a really critical one because they deal with market fairness, they deal with market power issues, and they will need to be central in terms of how we think about this going forward. So that's all from me. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So I will stop my screen share.
So that was so great. So much to think about. What we're going to do is to break out into smaller groups for 10 minutes, and then we'll reconvene because we do have plenty of time. And so we'll break out into groups of 4. One lucky group will get Denise. And then we'll come back and we'll proceed with the general Q&A. So Juliet, do you want to form us into groups?
Yep, everyone should be getting a notification in just a minute. A reminder.
Great. Okay, so if you want to ask a question to Denise, please raise your virtual hand, and that I see Cheryl is straight off the mark, and I was going to be the first, which is uncharacteristic for me, but you beat me to it, Cheryl, and so go ahead, and then my hand is going to be shoot up right away here, so go for it.
Okay, my question is about the concentration of wealth, okay, and the wealth is being used to buy and to fund initiatives that further increase that wealth. And so it strikes me that there are some simple things that could be done, like, for example, stock buybacks further concentrate wealth, and profits are being used for buybacks rather than investment in the firms. And so I didn't hear much about things that could be done across the board like that really wouldn't, I mean, it would be egalitarian. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you so much. And maybe I was just going to say, if people wouldn't mind, also when you ask your question, I'd love to just know who you are, maybe a sentence or two.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So Cheryl, please introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm retired from the technology industry. My concentration was actually in systems theory and economics. So in retirement, I'm following this very closely.
Oh, amazing.
I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Okay.
Oh, what a beautiful place. Yeah, so much to talk about with you. Yeah, so I didn't get into it much in this presentation, but absolutely. I mean, the book that I co-authored in 2018 really looked at concentrated markets across so many sectors of the US economy. We usually think of tech, but it's actually happening really across so many industries. It's kind of unfathomable. And there are many steps you could take to, well, first of all, that is, when you look at the macroeconomic effects of that types of concentration, it really, there's a plethora of literature now that shows that it increases inequality, it lowers workers' wages, consumers pay higher prices, it's harder for small businesses to get a foothold and grow, or they might get acquired by a tech company before they really have a chance to establish themselves and really be a competitor. There's so many different things. It drags down growth. I mean, I'm not, I don't subscribe to kind of traditional notions of growth, but if you do, productivity is down as well, and all these different effects. So certainly there are, I mean, a lot of our argument was that actually we need more competition, and especially in US markets. But I agree with you that there's an adjacent set of issues around how firms have become so financialized that they now, like, one of my favorite examples is that there was a year in which Tesla made more money selling carbon credits to other companies and Bitcoin than it ever did selling any cars, right? And the same thing with Apple, that Apple's operating income has remained the same for about 4 or 5 years, and yet their profit margins have grown enormously. And the only reason that happens, of course, is because you can either do economic rent extraction, or you can find all these other fanciful notions of inflating your balance sheet, like stock buybacks. And stock buybacks used to be illegal. They were illegal at one point, and then we allowed them. I don't think, I think stock, like, buybacks are kind of a symptom of this larger set of issues, but I certainly think that they're an important one. And people have, I'm not an expert on buybacks, but people have, come up with different ways that we could address that as just one of the examples in which companies have been able to increase their profit margins. The other one I'll just mention quickly is, like, during the pandemic and during the last few years, where there was this narrative of inflation, people, it coincided with the highest profit margins in 70 years for firms. And so a lot of the academic competition community as well wondered how much essentially the market power of dominant firms to just raise prices kind of indiscriminately using the cover of the inflation narrative also contributed. And some of the studies show that it's not an insignificant, it might be a third or more of the profit margins actually came just because companies inflated well above the rises in their actual production costs. Because if they were just raising their prices in accordance with how much their input costs were rising, you wouldn't see the inflation in the profit margins. So I think there's, like, many ways that we can address this, but I absolutely agree that it is a core way in which wealth, not just market power, but also wealth, can accumulate.
Wow. Every time I speak in my role of moderator, my hand goes down. So Hal, if you'll forgive me, let me ask a quick question and then proceed to you. So Denise, I was
Thank you,
talking
Florian.
a month or two, thank you. A month or two ago with Nick Hanauer at Civic Ventures,
Mhm.
and was surprised to be told that he actually thinks very highly of what the Biden administration is doing, and that they brought on people. And you had your own slide there with Timothy Wu and others that have been brought into the Biden administration. So I just wanted to get your own opinion as to what degree the Bidenomics, as it's being called, is actually making some of the right moves from your perspective.
I mean, I consider myself part of that part of that movement. So I'm an unbiased, or sorry, I'm a biased source, I suppose. But I absolutely think that what this comprehensive agenda that Tim Wu initiated at the White House, as well as Jonathan Kenter at the Department of Justice and Lena Khan at the Federal Trade Commission, what they have initiated is the biggest reconstitution of antitrust in 100 years, like since the antitrust laws originated. And they are holding nothing back. They're instituting a range of rulemakings and enforcement, actions and things like that to actually try to make a dent in this. And I think that they haven't won everything, and they're not going to, but they've certainly made some really significant strides. I can try to find it. The White House Competition Council that I mentioned, they just recently sort of reported back on some of the initiatives. So one of the things was like the executive order said that they were going to bring more generics into the country, generic drugs, and that they were going to make hearing aids widely accessible to the public at low cost. And those things they have done. They've also taken on things like the pharmacy benefit managers, which are gatekeepers in the middle of the healthcare market that squeeze profits, from both sides, and they inflate the costs of so much within the healthcare system. So they've done really, like, when you start to list it out, they've done so much, and across many, many different industries. They also have done a lot on agriculture. So they've gone after some of the big, like the meat packing, the dominant meat packers, which are 3 or 4 big companies that also have been accused of, inflating prices and all kinds of stuff. So I think that they have done an excellent job, and that they're really doing their best. Especially, they're facing a huge amount of pushback is the other thing. And so they're constantly just sort of like fighting for their own mandate to do their jobs. But the other big thing that they did was there's something called the merger guidelines, which tell firms basically how they're going to approach mergers and acquisitions. And every time a company merges and the value is over, I think it's like $101 million, they have to report it to the agencies and say, hey, we're planning to merge. And then the agencies may or may not review it and may challenge the merger. So the guidelines kind of lay out the agency's approach to those mergers and acquisitions. They did a huge update of those just recently. And that's really significant because mergers are obviously the biggest way in which power concentrates and markets concentrate. So they're taking much more aggressive stance on a lot of things, which I think are really important.
Gosh, I hope it becomes more widely known and contributes basically to re-election prospects. But Hal, and please introduce yourself.
Okay. Yeah, I've been had a couple of decades in corporate computing, and a lot of my life has been kind of dysfunctional. I figured out I had ADHD when I was 70, a year and a half ago. But one thing about ADHD is you do what's interesting. You may be oblivious to what's in your best interest, but you follow what's interesting. So what's interesting to me has been, what the fuck is going on? Why are we charging over a cliff like Lemmings? Why is this country doing that? Starting about 2010, when I began to see, people saying Obama is a Muslim. It's not just because Rush Limbaugh says so. It's because they're fed evidence, faked evidence that proves it, you know. So fake news was happening in 2010 in the form of forwarded chain emails, and I was investigating that. But my attempt to counter things, do blogging, debunk things was very unsuccessful, and I became more and more of just a scholar, learning social epistemology, neuroscience, evolutionary science, you know, uh, cultural evolution, you name it. I could write a list of 100 or 200 books that are relevant to ProSocial and categorize them, and that should be a project of mine. So that's the introduction. The question is, how are we going to, it's fine to analyze things and have theories, but our electoral system doesn't work. And I would say our electoral system needs to be more pro-social, and a way that it could be more pro-social is through something like ranked choice voting, which would bring in people representing different points of views. I think we could use a lot of like one issue parties, bringing the people passionate about that issue to the polls, to then vote for their second choice to vote for the person leading that one issue party, and their second choice being somebody sane. That's my model of how it would work.
Thoughts on that, Denise?
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree with you that, there's a range of issues about our democratic process. And I think, one of them too is that we've sort of over relied on strictly on the presidential elections or electoral politics.
Right.
Whereas like
the right has not over relied on that. They've worked from the ground up.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So not only, I mean, there's a big movement around like deliberative democracy and these other forms of more sort of localized democratic bodies, which is gaining a lot of traction and is really interesting, like citizens' assemblies and different things, which I find interesting. I'm definitely not an expert. But then also to your point, like, yeah, I mean, one of the things that's been most successful that conservative antitrust folks have done is, really inculcating their perspectives, their interpretations of the law into the judiciary, getting conservative judges elected, doing a kind of intellectual movement around these things. So yeah, so there's many ways in which not just through the electoral process, but also through the kind of, adjudication of the law and the kind of the administration of the law that you can change the approaches. And one of the problems that the Biden administration enforcers have encountered is they're bringing forward cases, and then they get some conservative judge that's looked at antitrust one way for 40 years and is kind of corporate friendly or whatever, rules against them. So without a judiciary that is willing to consider new evidence or think about markets in new ways, it is difficult to get the agenda through sometimes.
Yeah, that's
So,
great.
yeah.
Thank you. Don, please introduce yourself.
Hi, Don Dolcinos, calling from Colorado. Hi, Denise. Thanks. Great presentation. I pinned one of your slides. I work in technology, working currently on kind of climate, clean energy stuff. But in a past life, worked for an organization that was established. It was nonprofit R&D under the Cooperative Research and Development Act. And so when I looked at your slide about other competitor kind of collaborations, that's one of them, right? Technology for sure. So is there other promising directions, or are there established, protections like that, or could we get some in the use case you're talking about?
Yeah, could you share more about, I'm not familiar with that,
The
with
Cooperative
the
Research and
R&D.
Development Act.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so this goes back, I think the 1980s Act of Congress, and it provided protection for collaboration among competing technology companies in a particular vertical market to do advanced research, in the premise that the advanced research would benefit all, not just those companies inside the organization.
Mm. And is that still on the books, to your knowledge?
If so, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, this is why it's also interesting, because sometimes, you know, these bodies of law like intersect each other, or but the primary way that the antitrust agencies have dealt with this is through these competitor collaboration guidelines, which are not legislative changes, but they help the courts interpret cases. And they also, you know, oftentimes like the corporate law community will use them to advise clients and things like that. So I think what you've seen in the UK and the EU is that they have recently updated these guidelines, and then they've included specific examples, or in some cases, explicit exemptions around sustainability related collaborations, and saying, you know, we're not going to take you on, even if there might be some reduction in competition. This is how we're going to analyze it. They've also signaled that they have a more open door policy. So if companies are confused or have a project that they want to carry forward that they're not sure would violate, that they could come and speak to the agencies, and the agencies will help them figure it out. So that's kind of the most that's happened on the antitrust side, aside from, as I mentioned, the legislative change in Austria. But I'm not sure how that would interact with, as an example, that the Cooperation R&D Act that you're referencing. That's really interesting. I'm going to look into it further.
Yeah, I don't think it would interact so much as it's a model for what could be done around sustainability. And maybe if there is not an existing kind of law that governs, you know, sustainability, there could be. And we have currently an administration would be favorable towards that, if that's, you know, a path. It's not an easy path legislatively,
sure.
but it's a path.
Right.
Anyway.
It is interesting though, because, you know, it's like, so the International Chamber of Commerce wrote a report called When Chilling Contributes to Warming, and they tried to list all these examples of private sector collaboration that they argued was getting chilled by this antitrust issue. And like one of the examples they said was, okay, let's say that, you know, data cloud storage providers want to get together and share information, share data, so that they can have better energy efficiency. And it's like, okay, well, that sounds really great on paper, but let's just think for 2 seconds about, you know, who are the big cloud storage providers? It's Amazon, it's Microsoft, it's, you know, and what kind of data are they going to share? And, you know, and so I do think that that's why this gets challenging, because you don't want to insert too many loopholes into the law that then just, you know, let Google and Amazon build their and Meta build their supercomputers and share all kinds of data they don't need to be doing, while at the same time encouraging, you know, these pro-social collaborations that might help. So yeah, I'm going to look at the Cooperation R&D Act. It sounds really interesting.
Thanks.
Right. Thank you. Well, Denise, when I write about this kind of thing from a multi-level perspective, I say very glibly, I think, based on your talk, that first and foremost, it's the whole system that must be the target of selection. And then the second thing I say is that variation must be oriented around the target. And then better practices must be identified and replicated, realizing that they'll always be sensitive to context. And your talk makes me realize how hard that those objectives are. But nevertheless, it does seem to me to provide, you know, a bit of guidance. And so I'm kind of imagining that if you were to try to follow that in practical terms with your goals, methods, and technical implementations, so what would it mean to take a whole system approach? It would have to be, you know, hugely multivariable, that when anything within the system is seeking a change, then to monitor the consequences of that would be a whole project and challenge in order to know what would be the consequences, including unforeseen consequences in addition to foreseen consequences, and all the loopholes that you'd call it. There'd have to be a way to monitor and to measure that. And if you could, and that would require a lot of transparency and so on, then it might be the case that if there was a proposed merger or any proposed action, and that there was that degree of information surrounding it, then you could make a decision based on whether or not it led to an overall systemic good or not. And then that would provide room for market competition and so on. That could be richly competitive, favoring entrepreneurship. So the good side of competition, that could be very much a part of it. But does that seem at all workable to you? Or just unrealistic? So there's my
No,
question.
no. Yeah, no, it's not unrealistic. It's exactly what the agencies have done. And you'll appreciate this, David, because I mean, once this is why it's so interesting, because what has tended to happen over the last 40 years is that, you know, these things are complex. And so what happened in around the 1970s and 1980s was those in the economics profession said, we can help you adjudicate these really hard questions, and we're going to take all of the sort of political, you know, allocation out of it, and we're just going to give you really comprehensive and neutral economic models to help you decide whether or not this, you know, this will enhance efficiency. And then of course the economics profession came to play a really important role in like adjudicating antitrust law. Now, a lot of people disagree with that, and there's a big pushback.
Well, you also said that, you know, they had a metric which was like consumer prices, or they had some kind of really
Yes.
narrow economic metric, whereas what would needed to be would be a much broader systemic set of metrics, right?
Well, and a lot of it, you know, is still around these sort of neoclassical economic models around like supply and demand curves and you know, general equilibrium and things that, you know, we all know are not, I mean, it's not the cutting edge of economics anymore. And in many ways, people have argued that actually this whole idea that economics is neutral was a way of just masking, you know, allocations of power through this sort of disguise of saying that, oh, we're going to give you all these neutral economic models to make your decisions. And, you know, who had the ability to hire the economists? It was typically, I mean, Amazon hires more PhD economists. The Federal Reserve hires the most PhD economists, and then Amazon hires the second amount of PhD economists. So that's a big debate, is like, how do you economically qualify the benefits and harms? And now people are saying, well, we should bring in the environmental economists, and maybe we should use the social cost of carbon. And I mean, that's a whole other rabbit hole of debate about how to quantify. But yeah, definitely. That's the approach, because I mean, it's hard to figure out how you do it otherwise.
Right. Thank you very much. Marilyn, please introduce yourself.
Thank you. I hope this will be a good follow-up question to the comments you just gave, David. I'm a retired attorney, and I did spend some time practicing in the area of antitrust law, but I want to ask a question of Denise from a consumer perspective. As a consumer, I was subjected to the Sprint T-Mobile merger. I was a Sprint customer for many, many years, very happy with the service. And as the merger began to get implemented, I couldn't believe what I was experiencing. I obviously have since changed service, but I mean, they would make changes to my plan with no notice. T-Mobile would, and then I'd call customer service. They say, oh, well, we phased out the plan you had with Sprint, but it cost more. And it was, you know, it wasn't even discussed with me. Here's your options. We're phasing out the plan you're in. Would you like to be in this plan? Or they just, you know, did all kinds of things. Anyway, let me get to the question. So how can we get, when a merger is approved, you know, the economists and the lawyers for the people merging, they're making all their arguments why this is going to be beneficial and efficiencies will be passed on to the consumer, lower prices, and that's not how it's getting implemented. So when I was going through this as a consumer, I tried to research, and I believe there was a special master assigned to monitor the actual merger. And yet I couldn't find any way to contact them to give feedback. You know, so I think you mentioned in your presentation, Denise, that retrospectively, we see that these mergers don't accomplish what they argued they would. But is there some way we can make changes where feedback can be provided by the public, by the consumer who's supposed to be benefiting during the actual implementation of the merger instead of having it be an after effect?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I'll just say that, so one of the things that happens when mergers get approved is sometimes the agencies will put conditions on them, and it's called a consent decree. So they'll say, we're going to consent to allow you to merge if you meet these particular requirements, you know, and that those have been used so that's called a behavioral remedy. We're going to monitor your behavior after the fact. But recently, and this is a difference where the Biden administration has said, listen, that doesn't work because one, you know, you have to go back, you have to monitor it, you have to figure out if customers are getting annoyed and the prices are rising, all that. So one, it creates a big burden on the agencies to keep monitoring it. But two, it's like, you know, firms are going to go ahead and do what they're going to do. And they're probably, you know, they don't really care about the consent decrees. They violate them all the time. So what they've said is that you need more of a structural approach, which is we should have blocked that merger to begin with. So you don't have to deal with the consequences on the back end of it. You know, that's harder to do, but that's the approach that they're taking because they think that the behavioral stuff is harder to implement after the fact. And I think your experience is definitely representative of, you know, not every merger is bad, of course, but typically especially when you get mergers of the, you know, where you're effectively only getting to 3 big companies across the entire industry, you know, you've now got an oligopoly, and oligopolies raise prices. That's what they do. So, and provide worse service, you know.
So, but that sounded quite generic. We're just not going to have mergers at all. Did I understand that correctly? Which would then
no, but I mean, in that case, I mean, the Sprint, that was a mega merger. That was, you know, that was going down to from, I don't know, 5 competitors to 3 or whatever main competitors. So the agencies also have something called they have different ways of calculating market concentration. And typically if it's a very small merger, they don't, you know, one, usually you don't even have to report it, but 2, they probably don't worry about it as much as the really mega mergers that are going to concentrate into just a few players. Those are the ones they take a lot more interest in.
From other speakers,
I believe that one was approved under the Trump administration. And here's the other thing is, once the ball gets rolling, there's no way to undo it. I mean, you can't undo an approved merger, it seems like. So I just wanted to offer my personal experience.
You can undo it. It just takes a long time. So you can break up companies, and they've done that in the past, like Standard Oil, and they tried to do it with Microsoft. But it's a lot harder to do it after the fact than just blocking it from the beginning. So for sure.
So Gavin, I hope you'll weigh in. You just left a comment. Let me quickly insert that from other speakers, I've learned about social accounting, which is, as I understand it, is basically it's a method and an obligation for companies to account for their externalities, and that's been actually mandated by some nations. I think South Africa, I was told, has mandated social accounting. So that would be then the obligation would be placed on the company to account for the consequences of their actions, basically. And if that could be enforced, wouldn't that be then a contribution to the solution? Have you heard much about social accounting and that movement?
I've heard about a number of different types of movements like that, impact weighted accounting at Harvard, and others, the social cost of carbon and things like that. And so there's a number of different ways that people are saying that they want to. Thanks, Ken. And Gavin, I love your suggestion. I think that's a good one. so there's a number of ways that people have proposed. One of the other conversations within antitrust is that typically, like if the government takes on a case, they want to block a merger, they want to bring an enforcement, they want to litigate a company. Typically, the burden of proof falls on the agency to prove why this is a problem. And people have said we need to reverse the burden of proof, and we need to have companies basically do all their own accounting as to why they're going to generate all these benefits and why they should be allowed to merge, or why this isn't anti-competitive and stuff like that. And that would go a long way as well, as putting the burden on the companies to defend their position versus the agencies having to defend their position. And I think that some of those new accounting frameworks could definitely play a role.
Great. Hal.
Okay, well, Denise, your Columbia colleague, Richard John, wrote a book about how what was presented as a breakup of a monster monopoly, AT&T, had kind of perverse effects. AT&T for decades was so thoroughly regulated that it became an idea factory for almost like a mega university. Basically, it created the entire basis of the electronic world infrastructure: transistors, integrated circuits, lasers, so much more than that. The programming languages and operating systems that we use. So actually now he's writing a book on monopoly, where I think the main theme is how everything about monopoly is full of contradictions and weirdness. But I guess, since then, there's been nothing like it, and every new idea has been thoroughly owned by somebody. Every major new idea has been thoroughly owned by somebody and created a gigantic network effect, like the social media companies from Google to et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
How do you?
Yeah, so the AT&T example is interesting. I haven't read his book. What I've more heard is that actually and this is one of the arguments, is that sometimes when companies get so large, they may be very innovative. They might have a lot of internal R&D, but they sometimes fail to commercialize it because it's not core to their business model, or they can make money just extracting rents or something. So it's like harder to innovate and bring a new product to market than it is to just jack up prices on your consumers, right? So that's one of the arguments, is like there's a whole literature around innovation and monopolies. But to your point, yes, the reason why this is complicated is because there are some instances in which, like, network effects. I don't want to be on Facebook unless everybody else is on Facebook. I don't want to use Uber unless there's enough drivers and enough customers to make it a viable business model. And so there are instances where those economies of scale, or those economies of scope, or those network effects make it such that you're only going to get a few players at the top of an industry, likely, because it just doesn't make sense to have a bunch of competitors. That's not true in every industry, but certainly in some, especially technology or even financial markets, it lends itself sometimes more to those scaled types of businesses.
Scaling has become the holy grail of startups.
Yeah. Okay, well, we are at time, and so it was awesome, and it has been recorded, and so that means that others can experience this. And so thanks to Juliet for her moderation, and to all of you for attending. And next week we have another great seminar. What is it, Jerome Warren, on the nature of cooperatives, I believe. Is that right, Juliet?
Yes, and the link to our YouTube channels in the chat, where this recording will be available in a few days. You can also scroll up and see our calendar of events, which has all of our upcoming seminars. every
Yep,
Friday.
and you can easily enough, you can find if you want to join the get more involved in the pro-social world, then check out the ProSocial Commons, and so we can see yet more of each other. So thanks to everybody, and until the next time. Thank you,
Thank
Denise.
you.